The atmosphere, I was just down there for St. Patrick's Day, and it was pretty grim. I don't know if anyone would like that.
Was that a Sunday morning?
It was, no, I was there on Saturday night.
Okay.
Well, it's the night atmosphere starts at about 2 p.m. So, do you know the bars open at 8 a.m. for people? Amazing. Ed Sheeran, if he wants to get a drink in,
he'll be there.
It could be possible.
I mean, he seems like a nice guy, but I wouldn't go to his concerts. I'm kind of more Green Day and Bruno and Lady Gaga and yeah. I go to all.
You're contemporary.
I love all, and he seems nice and everything.
He certainly does.
Jim, are you an Ed Sheeran fan?
But I'm not really. His music's a bit maudlin.
Well, he began to pass me by, but then I started hearing more of his songs, like probably a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to dislike about
No,
Ed Sheeran,
there's a couple of them are quite nice at the moment, but I haven't got there. Steve would like to go see him, but he wants to go and see Coldplay. I don't mind them, but I don't know yet.
Okay.
I'm thinking.
The super grands have taken on the oil and gas industry today. Several dozen grandparents, the super grands,
awesome,
joined the protest at the New Zealand Petroleum Conference in Wellington on behalf of future generations.
Good on them.
So there are two arguments, aren't there? There's the argument that the economy needs oil and gas can transition us away from coal, for example. Greenpeace argues the industry is already reinventing itself with cleaner energy sources, and we'd be better off forging ahead with renewables. Where do you stand on the need to keep looking for oil and gas offshore?
We got to go renewable, I think.
Okay, so we just let it gradually run down, the industry?
Well, I think, we got to look at what's happening, and I say good on the super grands or whatever they are, the super peeps. Definitely.
I live in a bubble, and when I was growing up, I was sure that one of the things we're most proud of as New Zealanders behind wearing jandals and the All Blacks was being nuclear free.
Yeah.
And David Longy going to the Oxford Union and really sticking it to the Yanks, that kind of thing. And it's just interesting now that in 2000 and what year are we in? 18. That the culture's almost changed in a way, and there's kind of this corporate, people love saying economic growth, and they love pushing towards the need to keep on growing the economy. And I was like, New Zealand, this is what we're proud of. And I think those guys are great patriots in a way for doing the New Zealand thing and standing up to them down there, even if it's a small protest. Good on them. It's fantastic. But you're asking, Jim, what is the actual pragmatic solution?
Well, I just wanted your opinion, because people are somewhere on the continuum.
We should be. It's something we're proud of, and we should be world leaders, right? And if it means that we're going to be the first ones to stop exploring, then so be it.
Before we go, more protesting in Auckland. This is just a very quick question to you. There's some degree of rejection, apparently, about Auckland Council, an idea out of Auckland Council to make rubbish collections fortnightly. How well would you get on having your rubbish collected only every 2 weeks?
Well, the other week I did, because they forgot. The council forgot the whole side of the street. So our bins all sat out there for a week. Well, if they wanted to do that, you need bigger bins.
Yes, bigger bins.
Bigger bins. Think about the rats. I'm rural. Think about the rats having a lovely field day, eating all the rubbish. And come on, what do we pay our rates for?
Okay.
Seriously.
What do we pay our rates for? What do you think?
I'm with her. Think about the rats.
Think about the rats.
Think about the rats. I haven't been thinking about the rats, but now I'm thinking about them. I'm terrified. Absolutely terrified.
And they're big where I come from.
Guy Williams, Julia Hartley-Moore have been on the panel. Thank you both so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Lovely to have your company and everybody else's company. Checkpoint coming right up.
Toti mai rā I hoa mai he kōrero kei te haere hei kaupapa kei te whakarawhiua. Tonight on Checkpoint, mould, rot and even asbestos in hospital buildings at the county's Manukau DHB. We speak to the acting CEO who describes the pressure to stay in surplus and tells us repairs or a rebuild could cost $1.6 billion. Plus, why New Zealand is the only member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance not to take retaliatory action against Russia. A farmer who sent a herd of calves with Mycoplasma bovis to slaughter wonders why he's still waiting for compensation 6 months on. RNZ News executive Carol Hirschfeld resigned suddenly over a meeting with Broadcasting Minister Claire Curran. And former Wallaby turned commentator Peter Fitzsimons pledges his brain to science so concussion injuries can be better understood.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The Broadcasting Minister still has the Prime Minister's support despite the resignation of a senior RNZ News executive. Claire Curran has come under pressure over meeting Carol Hirschfeld in December and initially failing to disclose it in response to parliamentary questions. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
Carol Hirschfeld resigned today as RNZ's head of news after misleading her chief executive over the meeting at a Wellington cafe. She repeatedly told Paul Thompson the meeting was coincidental, but admitted on Sunday it was pre-arranged. The meeting had already attracted political criticism from National, as it was not included in the minister's diary. Jacinda Ardern says Claire Curran has not offered her resignation. She says her expectation is that when ministers make mistakes, they correct the record as quickly as possible, which she says Ms Curran did. Atu i te whare pārimata, ko Chris Bramwell aho.
The National Party is backing the Prime Minister's decision not to expel Russian diplomats. New Zealand is now the only member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance not to have taken retaliatory action against Russia over the nerve agent attack in Britain. Jacinda Ardern says she's been assured there are no covert Russian intelligence agents in New Zealand. Security analyst Paul Buchanan has criticised that stance as either highly diplomatic, disingenuous or completely naive. But National's leader Simon Bridges says Ms Ardern is doing the right thing.
I agree that we need to have a critical eye on issues such as this, but the Prime Minister's position, as I understand it, is there are no effectively spies, and so I take her at the word, but I would hope and expect that she's taking these sort of matters, as she would with other significant players in New Zealand, seriously.
Simon Bridges. Australia has ordered 2 diplomats identified as undeclared intelligence officers to leave the country within 7 days. A drone has come within 5 metres of an Air New Zealand international flight coming into land at Auckland Airport. The airline says the pilots of the flight from Tokyo, with 278 people on board, spotted the drone during their descent on Sunday afternoon. It was so close they feared it might be sucked in by an engine. The president of the Airline Pilots Association, Tim Robinson, says the incident could have ended catastrophically.
This is not good. Now we're seeing these incidences occurring more and more. They're becoming more and more frequent, and certainly this is the closest one we've seen. 5 metres is very close for a big passenger transport aircraft. The consequences of it striking the aircraft could have been catastrophic, and certainly something needs to be done urgently now to address these type of situations.
Tim Robinson says drones should be registered. An inquiry into allegations of spying by Thomson and Clark has been widened to cover another government agency's use of the controversial security company. Earlier this month, the State Services Commission appointed a senior public servant, Doug Martin, to investigate Southern Response's use of the firm, which had been accused of spying on customers. Conan Young reports.
As well as Southern Response, Mr Martin will now also look at the relationship between Thomson and Clark and the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. RNZ News understands this will involve considering whether the ministry preserved the necessary neutrality when dealing with the firm. A call for the inquiry to be widened came from Greenpeace, which says the ministry hired the firm to spy on it. The ministry says it used its services in 2013, but has not done so since then. Ko Conan Young tēnei.
A North Canterbury farmer whose cattle were slaughtered after Mycoplasma bovis was found on his farm fears it may be years before he's compensated. The government, which plans to cull all infected cattle, has said affected farmers will be compensated for verifiable losses. Kerry Dwyer, who ran a calf rearing business near Oamaru, sent all 400 of his calves to slaughter last September, but says he can't start rebuilding his business until the Ministry for Primary Industries pays him for his loss.
I would like MPI compensation to publicise their guidelines on how they assess claims, and I would like some independent people to review those guidelines before we get into court cases arguing with them.
Kerry Dwyer. The ministry says it's boosting its capacity to process claims as quickly as possible. It's 5:04. Sport. The England cricket captain Joe Root says they need to learn some lessons fast if they're to salvage the 2-test series against New Zealand. The visitors emphatically lost the opener by an innings and 49 runs last night at Eden Park, giving New Zealand their 10th test victory against England. Root says England must do better, although they'll fall into their first series defeat to the Black Caps since 1999.
this game, this first innings, we didn't adapt quickly enough to the situation and the conditions. That is very disappointing because we're used to the ball seaming around, we're used to it swinging, and no stage did anyone get themselves in, and we didn't create any partnerships, which obviously are fundamentals that you need to have to make big scores of 350, 400.
The England captain Joe Root, the second test starts in Christchurch on Friday. The Mystics head coach Helene Wilson believes that ANZ Premiership netball franchises need to take more responsibility for their players' performance in the Silver Ferns after a disappointing international season. Wilson says she feels it's her duty to prepare her players as much as the Silver Ferns coach Janine Southby, and other teams should do the same. She says they have players for 7 months of the year and Southby only gets them for a few days before a test match. And the Warriors have been named as one of the 4 NRL Women's Premiership teams to start in a new competition that will run over 4 weeks alongside the 2018 finals. That's the news.
Threats.
This is stuff that happens in Zimbabwe, not modern day New Zealand. We're an open, transparent democracy. We should not have ministers sending government MPs along to issue threats.
Deals.
Our estimates are pretty likely to be accurate, but what I'm saying to you is that you don't know what you don't know.
Games.
It's really the administrators saying we need people to watch, and we'll stand on our heads and dance if we need to.
All the action. Morning Report with Sudie Ferguson and Guy and Espina, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, the UN Special Rapporteur on discrimination against women on the Me Too movement and men who are champions for change. And after 10, comedians at the top of their game, Madeline Sami and Jackie Van Beek, on their new film, The Breaker-Upperers. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Net service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waikato, also Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumaranui. Long fine spells and isolated showers, cloud increasing late tomorrow. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine. For the remainder of the North Island, fine today, apart from cloudy periods in Kapiti and Wellington. Scattered rain tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough, cloud increasing, rain developing this evening with heavy falls about the ranges, becoming fine tomorrow morning. Canterbury, high cloud, rain about the ranges and a few spots elsewhere. Severe gales about the high country, easing tonight, becoming fine tomorrow morning. Otago, rain clearing this afternoon, they're mostly fine. Bulla and Westland, occasional rain with heavy falls and possible thunderstorms, easing to isolated showers today, becoming fine tomorrow. Fiordland and Southland, showers about Fiordland spreading to Southland later today. Some heavy falls about Fiordland and Fovo Strait, showers easing tomorrow. And the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a chance of a shower. It's coming up to 8 minutes past 5 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight on the program. Russian spies and NZ, Claire Curran and RNZ, and Mycoplasma bovis and MPI. But we begin tonight with the county's Manukau DHB and 4 Middlemore Hospital buildings that are full of rot and potentially dangerous mould. This was broken by our colleagues Phil Pennington and Ruth Hill on Morning Report. Meanwhile, Checkpoint, as you'll know, has been looking at growing DHB debt and the pressure on DHBs to stay in surplus. Tonight, those two strands meet because the acting CEO of the county's Manukau DHB tells us spending what they needed to on building remediation would have put them in deficit, and they were under pressure to stay in surplus. I spoke to Dr. Gloria Johnson earlier this afternoon, and she began by telling me about the scoping and assessments to identify the extent of the problem with buildings at Middlemore.
And we've identified that we've got problems in multiple buildings over 4 main areas. We have the recladding issues in 4 buildings and less serious recladding issues in a number of other buildings as well on various sites. But those recladding issues in the 4 buildings on the Middlemore site are obviously all particularly serious ones. We also have asbestos issues in a number of buildings. We have seismic issues in a number of buildings, and we have serious deferred maintenance issues in buildings as well. And some of our buildings have all of those problems together.
Why hasn't something meaningful been done before now? The independent appraisal by Robertson & Co. says issues were identified in the Scott building in 2012. We're talking about weather tightness here. So we are talking about leaking, mould, rot. Scott building 2012, Kids First 2013, the super clinic between 2012 and 2014. So that's 4 to 6 years ago. Why wasn't meaningful remediation undertaken?
So, with regard to the recladding issues in particular, some of the delay was because of the decision to actually pursue legal action against the contractor,
Hawkins.
and that then became caught up in a very protracted process that only got resolved by the beginning of last year. But in general terms, I think we have a problem with a reluctance to actually identify the scale of the problem and therefore the cost and the effort that might be required to fix the problems, because of a belief in the health sector that we were not going to be able to actually get the capital investment required and that we were not going to be able to afford to engage in the work. And I think this is true not just of the need to remediate buildings, but to also invest in new buildings. So we're way behind with that as well. And I think that we have been in a position of kind of assuming that there was no point in asking because we wouldn't be able to actually get the financial support that we require.
Okay, that's really big. So why were those assumptions made? Were you or your predecessors explicitly told, do not put a business case in for this remediation because there is no money?
No, we certainly weren't explicitly told that. But what we do know is that particularly from the time of the Christchurch earthquakes onwards, when obviously a lot of resource was having to be diverted into dealing with the issues in services there, we were certainly given to understand as a sector that there was very limited capital available for other things. And I think that the ministry itself, and I know Treasury, in fact, had become increasingly frustrated in recent times about feeling that they actually didn't know what the size of the problem was in the health sector, because none of us were putting forward cases, because, you know, it costs quite a lot to actually work up a business case. So you're not going to do it.
Yes, it does.
Unless
Yes,
you're
it
confident
does.
it's going to get across the line.
And look, I've got the Treasury document because I've been looking at the overall cost of the CapEx that needs to be done just to get DHBs to where they ought to be, not to future-proof them. And I've got a Treasury document that says, and I quote, some DHBs look to be sweating their assets and underfunding repairs and maintenance to help balance their books. Was that you?
Yes, I think that was.
Okay.
I think that's another issue as well. Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
So that was you. Why were you doing it? Why was the DHB doing it? In other words, either the pressure was direct and explicit, or you guys were surrendering to shadows.
Well, DHBs have certainly been under very explicit expectations from ministers to meet their financial targets, to operate within their budgets. And what we know, of course, is that particularly because of the capital charge system in this country, if we do invest, if we do spend capital, then we get charged interest. We also acquire depreciation, and that then affects our operational budgets and runs the risk that we will run into deficit. It was certainly recognised in our DHB that if we invested as much as we thought we would need to, both in developing new facilities and in remediation, then that would inevitably lead us into a deficit position.
And if I look at your, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to, I really want to see this materially and meaningfully expressed. The county's Manukau DHB Annual Plan 2016-17. The DHB explicitly tells the Ministry and the Minister clear indications from the Minister and Ministry of Health are of continued and significant tightening fiscal position. Now, this is from your annual plan. The annual plan goes on to say, as a result, increasingly tough decisions have been made and will continue to be required, right? That was your position.
Yes.
And that meant that you had rotting buildings that you weren't doing remediation on, right?
Yes, it meant that there were a lot of things that we weren't doing, I guess, in order to be able to reprioritise the money to the things that we thought were most important.
I'm sorry to
and urgent.
interrupt, but this is really material. And the money that you were reprioritising, it seems to me from your annual plan, was being reprioritised to keeping you out of deficit. And there is a letter in your and there is a letter in your annual plan from Jonathan Coleman dated 27 October 2016 entitled Living Within Our Means, and it says, I am pleased to see that your DHB is planning a surplus for 16-17 and for the following 3 years. So were you not doing the work that was required because your minister wanted you to stay in surplus?
Yes, I think the government, and I think the whole government has expected the health sector to be able to live within its means. And in order to do that, we have had to compromise on our capital investment programs.
But living within your means here is such a false economy, isn't it? Because you now have these stinking, rotten, and potentially dangerous buildings.
Yes, but even more urgently, we have a need for new buildings to develop additional capacity to deal with the rise in demand. And that's why we actually consider that to be our more urgent problem. We can't afford to wait until we've finished all the remediation work before we start investing in new capacity, because we need new capacity now as well.
So, sorry, forgive me. So to paraphrase, what you're saying there is if you remediate these crappy, stinking, awful old buildings, actually increased demand, the growing population out there, means that you are spending a whole lot of money and it will still be inadequate.
Yes, remediating those buildings will not increase our capacity. And we need additional capacity even more urgently than we need to remediate the buildings.
Do you need to knock them down and start from scratch?
Well, that's one of the things that you start to wonder. We certainly are aware of that with one of our buildings in particular. So we have a building called the Galbraith building, which is actually two buildings joined together. We've got a number of clinical services in there, including the entire maternal health service, which is the biggest maternal health service in the country. That building has multiple problems with it, including serious seismic issues as well as asbestos. And we are currently getting quotes on what it would take to be able to remediate it to deal with the seismic issues in particular, taking into account that any remediation is likely to disturb asbestos, which will make it even more difficult and expensive. The building not only houses clinical services but has critical infrastructure for the rest of the campus, the other hospital buildings running underneath it and a plant room in it. We suspect that the cost of remediation is going to be at least the same as what it would cost to build a new building. And if we remediated it, we would still have a very old building. It's a 1960s building. So in fact, probably the right option for it is to build a new building instead and then knock it down. So we certainly are at a point where we do need to consider to what extent it's actually worth investing in the remediation of old buildings when maybe what we really need to do is to be investing in new buildings to replace them.
One final question, and this is the big one, I guess. How much are we talking about here, all up, to either meaningfully and reasonably remediate, or to start from scratch and do what you're talking about, which is get it right as a greenfields project?
I'm not sure what it would cost to do an entire greenfields project. I do know that the 5-year plus program that we've got at the moment for remediation and building new buildings on the Middlemore site and our other sites in order to expand to meet medium-term demand is in the order of $1.6 billion. I expect you could probably get an entire new major acute hospital for a similar amount of money. The reality is we may need both, given the growth in Auckland.
Dr. Gloria Johnson, who is the acting CEO of the county's Manukau DHB. The Health Minister, Dr. David Clark, declined an interview. He has a meeting with the acting chair of the county's Manukau DHB later this week. In a statement, he said the previous government neglected and underfunded our hospitals. This government is committed to a well-funded public health system, but the reality is that the legacy of underfunding will take some years to turn around. And over the next few nights, Checkpoint is going to quantify how much money is required. New Zealand is now the only member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance to have not taken retaliatory action against Russia over the nerve agent attack on a former Russian spy and his daughter. Britain has blamed the attack in Salisbury 3 weeks ago directly on Moscow and has been urging its allies to take some action in response. Today, Canada, the US and Australia answered that call, joining Britain and a number of EU countries in expelling dozens of Russian diplomats and undeclared intelligence staff. Katie Doyle has more.
In announcing Australia's move, the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull had some stern words for Russia. He says Australia won't tolerate the reckless undermining of international law or the assault on the sovereignty of nations and stands in solidarity with Britain and its allies.
The brazen attack, the criminal attack in the United Kingdom in Salisbury on the 4th of March was an attack on all of us. It was an attack on the sovereignty of every nation that respects the rule of law, and that is why we are taking this action today.
The Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, says there are 2 diplomats in Canberra identified as undeclared intelligence officers, and they have been told to leave Australia within 7 days. She says the nerve agent attack is just the latest in a long line of incidents in which Russia is threatening the democratic world.
Political assassinations, cyber attacks, the illegal annexation of Crimea, invasions of other countries' territory, Georgia, Ukraine, its disruptive role in the investigation into the downing of MH17.
But on this side of the Tasman, it's a different story. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade has assured her there are no covert Russian intelligence agents in New Zealand.
We've done a check in New Zealand. We don't have Russian undeclared intelligence officers here. If we did, we would expel them.
The National leader, Simon Bridges, says Ms Ardern is correct given the information she has.
I agree that we need to have a critical eye on issues such as this, but the Prime Minister's position, as I understand it, is there are no effectively spies, and so I take her at the word, but I would hope and expect that she's taking these sort of matters, as she would with other significant players in New Zealand, seriously.
Former intelligence analyst and security consultant Paul Buchanan says Jacinda Ardern's comments are either highly diplomatic, disingenuous or completely naive. He says 3 of the 8 Russian diplomats in New Zealand are attachés, who are widely known to be intelligence collectors.
They can be military, they can be from the intelligence services, but they are the credentialed intelligence collectors assigned to any embassy, particularly great power embassies. It's akin to an open source intelligence collection service. They're credentialed, they go, they talk with people. They don't engage in espionage per se, but they're there.
But Massey University Professor of Defence and Security Studies, Ruben Azizian, says the global expulsion of Russian diplomats is more of a stunt and won't make a big difference.
Why do we have to wait until a chemical attack happens? Russia has been under sanctions by Western nations for a long time. And yet, being under sanctions, I understand that all these Western countries continue to tolerate a large number of intelligence officers. We're talking 60 people from U.S. Are we saying U.S. tolerated 60 undeclared intelligence officers in the United States for all these years?
Professor Ruben Azizian says expelling ambassadors in the wake of the nerve agent attack would send a far stronger message to Russia than getting rid of undeclared intelligence agents. For Checkpoint, I'm Katie Doyle.
And we'll have more on this later in the programme. The Prime Minister is backing the Broadcasting Minister Claire Curran in the wake of the resignation of high-profile RNZ News executive Carol Hirschfeld. The shock resignation follows a meeting with the Minister that took place at a Wellington cafe last December. Ms Curran has been under political pressure over the incident, including for initially failing to declare the meeting in response to parliamentary questions. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
This has all occurred in the context of Labour's policy to create RNZ Plus, with $38 million of extra money for public broadcasting to be overseen by the Public Media Funding Commission. Questions around the meeting between Carol Hirschfeld and the Minister first arose in Parliament in February, when National's Melissa Lee asked Claire Curran why she had not disclosed it in her answer to a written question. Ms Lee asked the Minister how she could stand by her original response.
When she failed to mention her breakfast meeting with RNZ Head of Content Carol Hirschfeld on December 2. Mr Speaker, I have a range of discussions, informal or otherwise, with many people in a range of portfolio areas.
RNZ CEO Paul Thompson says Ms Hirschfeld had repeatedly assured him the meeting was coincidental and that she and the Minister had talked after bumping into each other in a Wellington cafe. However, he says on Sunday she told him the meeting had in fact been scheduled. He says while this is not a great day, he does not believe this will damage RNZ's credibility.
Our journalism and our credibility and our editorial independence are absolutely rock solid, and I think the way we're handling this shows that. And we now go on and keep doing our job.
Nationals leader Simon Bridges says it appears to be a very serious, even unprecedented matter.
We need to get to the bottom of what's happened here, but it seems very serious if she has resigned, Carol Hirschfeld has resigned, and we need to understand what that means in relation to Claire Curran.
Ms Curran told reporters at Parliament she instigated the meeting to have a high-level discussion about the state of New Zealand media, and it was diaried 5 days beforehand. She says she now regrets the meeting.
It was not a secret meeting. It was held in one of the busiest cafes in Wellington. It was, as I believed at the time, an informal catch-up meeting. In hindsight, and now that I understand that RNZ has clear policies around meeting with ministers that I wasn't aware of at the time, I would not have that meeting again.
Paul Thompson and RNZ Chair Richard Griffin appeared before a select committee on the 1st of March, where they were grilled about the meeting. They told MPs they backed Carol Hirschfeld and her assertions it was a chance meeting. The select committee met again on the 22nd of March to consider the draft report from that appearance. Ms Curran says her office got in touch with RNZ twice during March.
On the 1st of March and the 22nd of March, my office contacted RNZ to raise the issue of the inconsistency between Ms Hirschfeld's account of how the meeting came about and my own.
So was that after the select committee hearing in
Yes.
which Paul Thompson and Richard Griffin
Yes.
effectively
and it then became a matter for RNZ to deal with.
Mr Thompson says he questioned Ms Hirschfeld again after the first contact from the Minister's office, was assured again it was a chance meeting, and that was relayed back to Claire Curran's office. National Simon Bridges questioned the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern about the actions of her minister in Parliament.
Does she accept that the meeting was clearly more than informal and coincidental?
But, Mr Speaker, Minister Curran has never claimed it was coincidental. She's acknowledged that it was in her diary. She did correct an original written question to make sure that it was correctly documented. And so from her perspective, that has always been the case. It was always scheduled and therefore not coincidental.
Richard Griffin says he's been in contact with the chairman of the Select Committee about correcting the public record. Carol Hirschfeld has not responded to requests for comment. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
It's 29 minutes past 5. Just before we move on to the 5:30 headlines, the ball tampering scandal involving the Australian cricket team shows no signs of abating. Australia's media is reporting that the team's head coach, Darren Lehmann, is set to resign sometime this evening. He hasn't done that yet, but they are strong reports. The team's suspended captain Steve Smith, who's been banned from the upcoming test against South Africa, has now stepped down from his very lucrative role as team captain of the Rajasthan Royals in the IPL League. That is the Indian 2020 League. Of course, the BBC sports editor Dan Rowan is in Cape Town and has more on the scandal's fallout.
The inquest had begun. Australian cricket investigators arriving at the team's Cape Town hotel this morning, sent here to get to the bottom of a scandal that stunned the sport. A warm welcome from spinner Nathan Lyon, one of those potentially implicated, but the next 24 hours could be painful for both players and management. Australia's plan to get junior batsman Cameron Bancroft to deliberately tamper with the ball using sticky tape in the match against South Africa quickly unravelled in the full glare of the TV cameras. The man known as the voice of Australian cricket today telling me just how much damage had been done by his compatriots.
I felt as it settled into my brain overnight a sense of sort of outrage that they should dare to perpetrate such a crime on the field. This was so blatant and, okay, a little bit premeditated as well. So I think that's what sticks in the craw of most Australian fans.
Australian captain Steve Smith confessed to the plot and has been suspended for one match, but his long-term position now looks untenable. The batsman today stepping aside as captain of Rajasthan Royals, his Indian Premier League team. The cheating that occurred here at Newlands on Saturday afternoon will go down as one of the most infamous episodes in cricket's history. A scandal that has shocked a sport and shamed a nation, and the full repercussions will soon become clear. Amid so much controversy, it's easy to forget there's another test match to be played in this acrimonious series. Australia, now trailing 2-1, will travel to Johannesburg tomorrow. But it's their actions here that threaten to overshadow their tour of South Africa.
That's the BBC's Dan Rowan from Cape Town. You are with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. Coming up, a farmer who sent his herd of 400 calves with Mycoplasma bovis to slaughter wonders why he's still waiting for compensation. 6 months on, far north communities hope a massive hole in State Highway 1 north of Kaitaia will be fixed by Easter, and former Wallaby turned commentator Peter Fitzsimons pledges his brain to science so concussion injuries can be more understood. Very big issue in New Zealand. Collision injuries, concussion injuries, particularly from rugby and rugby league. We'd love your feedback. Don't forget you can text us 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. And our email address is checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Business next, but before any of it, Katrina with the headlines.
The Prime Minister is still supporting the Broadcasting Minister despite the resignation of a senior RNZ news executive. Claire Curran has come under pressure over meeting Carol Hirschfeld in December and initially failing to disclose it in response to parliamentary questions. National is backing Jacinda Ardern's decision not to expel Russian diplomats over a nerve agent attack in Britain. New Zealand is the only Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance member not to have retaliated against Russia. The president of the Airline Pilots Association says a near miss involving a drone at Auckland Airport could have ended in catastrophe. Tim Robinson says drones should be registered. The drone came within 5 metres of a landing Air New Zealand international flight. A farmer whose cattle were slaughtered after the disease Mycoplasma bovis was found on his farm near Wamaru fears it may be years before he receives compensation. The government, which plans to cull all infected cattle, says affected farmers will be compensated for verifiable losses. An inquiry into allegations of spying by the security company Thompson & Clark has been widened to cover another government agency's use of the controversial firm. Earlier this month, the State Services Commission appointed a senior public servant to investigate Southern Response's use of the company, which had been accused of spying on customers. Asbestos has spilled onto a beach in Southland. The Invercargill City Council says it appears a former landfill site has eroded and asbestos has spilled onto the foreshore at Ocean Beach in Bluff, below the site of a former freezing works. And a search and rescue operation is underway for a hunter missing in Fiordland National Park. The 69-year-old man was reported missing this morning by his hunting partner. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina, which is about 26 minutes away. Let's turn to business news now with Emile Donovan, beaming in from Wellington. Hi, Emile. There was some good news today for lower paid workers at casino company Sky City.
That's right, yeah. Today, Sky City announced they'd be paying their workers a minimum of $20 an hour by 2020. That's sort of, we're talking waiters and waitresses and cleaners and the like, but that's actually about 1,800 people, nearly half of Sky City's workforce, so really nothing to be sniffed at there. So their wages will go up gradually over the next 3 years by about 7% a year. We actually had a chat to Sky City's Chief Executive, Graham Stevens, earlier on today. He said they felt like it was the right thing to do, but they can see some benefits for the company in the medium to long term as well.
I think a lot of other corporates have fewer numbers at that level, so we might have had to give it a bit more time and attention than others, but ultimately I think it's got to be the right direction of travel. It just means you've got a happier workforce. In our lives, hopefully, it also means we reduce turnover in that space. People feel they can commit their careers to us. We go through a lot of effort to train our people, and having them stay with us for longer is a good thing.
Sky City's Chief Executive Graham Stevens. Emile, this is obviously good news, having your minimum wage raised to $20 for people who are earning, $2 or $3 less than that currently. But the minimum wage was going to rise, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. So it was going to rise to $20 an hour by 2021 regardless. That's because of a coalition agreement between Labour and New Zealand First. But, Sky City is still getting there a year ahead of the curve, and I don't think any of those workers will be complaining, really.
Elsewhere, an iconic Kiwi clothing company has extended its portfolio, Emile.
That's right, yeah, we're talking about Swan Dry here. They're actually owned by a Christchurch-based company, Long Beach Holdings. Now, they've paid an undisclosed sum to buy up the wet weather clothing company Line 7. They're probably best known for a long association with the America's Cup. So a couple of Kiwi stalwarts coming together there. Now, Swan Dry's recently entered the UK and Australian markets. They've had quite a bit of success, and they'll be hoping Line 7's wet weather and agricultural and lifestyle lines will help to consolidate that.
Thanks, Emile. What happened on the markets today?
Well, the NZX 50's up 76 points. That's 0.9%. They closed at 8,508. The Kiwi dollar is steady. It's buying 72.9 US cents, 94.1 Australian and 51.2 pence.
Emile Donovan from Wellington, thank you very much. Let's go not far away from where Emile is to where John Law is, our Mid-Service meteorologist. Kia ora, John.
Kia ora. As we head into Wednesday, we have got a few showers still just about possible across the northern parts of the country, but really for many of us there's plenty of dry weather. Just a bit more cloud and temperatures in Auckland up to around 23 degrees Celsius. As we head further south, we will find more cloud pushing in towards particularly places like Taranaki, bringing with it some scattered rain as we go through the daytime. Just becoming a little bit more patchy as we head through and towards the afternoon. But for the likes of, say, Wellington, a front draped across those central parts of the country will bring more cloud and some wetter weather for the morning, easing off a touch as we head through in towards the afternoon. And a similar story across in towards Wairarapa as well. Further north, things are still looking generally dry. A bit more cloud in the mornings might just bring a bit of patchy drizzle to some of that higher ground across the central parts of the North Island. But head southwards down towards, say, Canterbury and even further south, we've got plenty of fine weather in store. Areas of cloud, but daytime highs in Christchurch of 22 degrees Celsius. With that lingering feature across the central parts of New Zealand, up towards Nelson and towards Marlborough, we will find still some showers to watch out for, but getting better and brighter through the daytime. And then do keep an eye on the radar down the far south. A few showers still lingering around that south coast for Invercargill, and perhaps one or two afternoon showers reaching up towards Dunedin as well. But daytime highs still up to around about 20 degrees Celsius. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Let's stay in the South Island. A farmer whose cattle were slaughtered after the disease Mycoplasma bovis was detected on his farm worries it might be years before he's rightfully compensated by the government. Kerry Dwyer, who ran a calf rearing business near Oamaru, sent all 400 of his calves to slaughter in September last year, but says he can't start rebuilding until the Ministry for Primary Industries pays him for his loss. Yesterday, the government announced all cattle affected with the disease will be culled, meaning more compensation claims will follow. Of course, here's Maya Burry.
In March last year, Kerry Dwyer bought some calves that were later found to be infected with Mycoplasma bovis, a disease which can cause lameness, abortions and mastitis in cows. Upon the positive test for the disease in August, MPI placed Mr Dwyer's entire Oamaru farm under a restricted place notice, meaning cattle could only leave the property to go to the meatworks. Mr Dwyer says with the support of the ministry, he and his wife Rosie decided to send their stock to slaughter. By the 14th of September, the farm was completely empty.
That was the only thing to do, because if we kept them here, ultimately we would have an animal welfare issue because we're overstocked as they get bigger. They start as little calves and they get bigger. We would end up overstocked, they'd be under stress, they would die of the disease, and we'd have an animal welfare issue, so we said we'll kill them.
MPI has said that farmers affected by Mycoplasma bovis will be compensated for their verifiable losses. But 6 months on from losing his livelihood, Mr Dwyer says they still haven't seen any money from the ministry and have struggled to get a clear answer about what they're eligible to be compensated for. He says he made a $180,000 claim for the loss of his 400 calves, which were all about $500 in value.
While they publicly say that they're going to compensate for verifiable losses, they actually have no guidelines. When I ask them for what the guidelines are that they give their assessors for dealing with compensation, they give me nothing because they haven't got anything.
Mr Dwyer says they lost money sending the cows to the meatworks because of levies and the demand for calf meat being low. He says without compensation, they can't afford to restock their farm and rebuild the business. He says they have been trying to make money other ways in the interim, but the stigma around the cattle disease had made that challenging.
We sold silage in November because that was permissible, and all the science around the disease shows that there was no chance of infection then. I was lined up to sell silage this coming week, and the buyer I had lined up tells me that his legal advice says don't come near me. So I've lost a buyer and I'm looking for more. That's pretty tough, yeah.
Yesterday, the government announced all cattle infected with Mycoplasma bovis will be culled at a cost of about $60 million. That figure includes compensation to farmers. The decision affects 28 farms, all but one of which are in the South Island, with the largest concentration in Southland. Mr Dwyer worries farmers may be staring down years of negotiations before their claims are settled.
There's people in Christchurch sitting 7 years after one earthquake waiting for compensation. We're dealing with the same sort of bureaucracy in MPI over this. I hope it doesn't take 7 years, but it might.
Kerry, I mean, plain and simple, what would you like to see happen?
I would like MPI compensation to publicise their guidelines on how they assess claims, and I would like some independent people to review those guidelines before we get into court cases arguing with them.
The Ministry for Primary Industries declined to be interviewed. In a statement, it said it's boosting its compensation capacity and capability to process claims as quickly as possible, so farmers aren't out of pocket for longer than they need to be. It says so far 5 farmers have received partial payments totalling $1.3 million, and it's advised farmers that the length of time it takes to get their claim processed is directly related to the information they provide. MPI says the process is appropriately rigorous because it's dealing with taxpayer money. For Checkpoint, Maya Burry.
Far north communities hope a massive hole in State Highway 1 north of Kaitaia will be fixed by Easter, which is this weekend. Torrential rain on Friday carved a 20-metre wide, 5-metre deep trench in the road, about 40k north of Kaitaia, cutting off the only public road to Cape Reinga. No mail has been able to get through and commuters are having to find other routes to get around. Easier said than done, but as Nita Blake-Person reports, many locals are finding silver linings in their newfound isolation.
He's not waiting. I'll be a good boy and wait.
Northland farmer Darcy was driving one of the 20 or so vehicles that joined a police convoy heading north along a forestry track this morning. Like many locals, he's been mainly driving along 90 Mile Beach to avoid the washout, but says having State Highway 1 cut off has been disruptive.
Yeah, it has held a few people up just getting goods out and in. And the mail isn't going through and stuff like that. And groceries and all that to the shop, so yeah, it has been held a few things up for a few people.
The forestry track adds around 40 minutes to commuters' journeys. It's unsealed, and while it was muddy and rough for the first few days the state highway was out of action, graders have whipped it into a smooth enough state. Convoys have been taking place twice daily at morning and night, but diverting traffic along the track means businesses in the small town of Pukenui, just north of the washout, have been hard hit. Darren Axe runs a coffee cart in the area and says things have been quiet.
It's been terrible. The local businesses in Pukenui have had no business because no one's come through. It's all been bypassed and come through this way. And yeah, it's been terrible for 3 days.
Rochelle Hodgson was one of several locals at the Pukenui side of the hole today, checking on progress. She teaches at Kaingarua Primary on the other side and hasn't been able to make it to work since the road was taken out. But she says it hasn't been all bad.
I went to the beach and I had a swim and it was beautiful. Today I'm going for a bike ride when there's no traffic, which is even better.
But the washout wasn't going to get the better of Pukenui Primary School student Tia Rose Niho. 11-year-old Tia usually gets driven to school, but when the road was cut off, her mum helped her find a new way of getting around on the water.
I've been paddleboarding across the lake or a river kind of thing. It's my mum's friend, her name's Joelle, and she lives by the end of the river, and then we go out to Waterfront Road, and then we stop there, and then I usually bike from there to school.
And while the disruption might be putting off some visitors, Finnish tourist Leia Selmavieta is enjoying the extra sunshine.
We were prepared. We have gas and like petrol and gas for the cooking and like food, and just really enjoying. And actually I enjoy more, I guess, now because there's like less tourists.
And some people are enjoying the quieter pace so much they're hopeful the road will never be repaired. Ollie Olsen says the washout has created an opportunity for the far north.
So that just separated us from the mainland, basically. So this is now a new island to New Zealand, and it's called Far Far North Island. We'll have to put up a wall, of course. We'll see if we can borrow the money from Trump.
The Transport Agency says convoys are being planned through the forestry track again tomorrow, but it hopes at least one lane of the repaired road will be open later this week in time for the long Easter holiday weekend. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Nita Blakeperson, aho.
More than 200 protesters spent much of the day attempting to shut down the country's biggest petroleum conference. They failed. The New Zealand Petroleum Conference ran all day today and will continue tomorrow. After having pizza delivered for lunch, the protesters wrapped up early afternoon. Katie Scotch was there, although not for the pizza.
Protesters blocked multiple entrances at TSB Arena earlier today, chanting and calling for change. They want an end to oil and gas drilling and prospecting. Police made 3 arrests and say one person was injured at the event, but declined police assistance for his injury. Protesters tied themselves to fences, held placards, kicked the building's walls and hit them with rocks. Former Green Party leader Jeanette Fitzsimons was among protesters.
There were a group of super grands of people 70s and over here blocking the doors. The police moved in behind us and kneed us in the back to try and get us to move. I wouldn't call it extreme violence, but it was uncomfortable and some people were hurting a bit.
The location of the conference was a secret, even to accredited media, until 3 days before the event in a bid to prevent protest action. Security was tight today, with a large police presence. Those needing to get into the building required an escort. Among the 500 people escorted in was the Energy and Resources Minister, Megan Woods. She says this year's block offers for potential oil and gas prospecting will be announced in a few weeks.
Our plan in terms of being carbon neutral by 2050, by being down to 100% renewable electricity by 2035, are very clear indicators of the pathway that this government wants to go on. And what our responsibility as a government now is to put together a very clear, a very predictable plan of what that transition looks like.
The head of the industry body, Cameron Madgwick, says they haven't spoken to the government about whether the 2018 block offer will go ahead. Protest organiser India Logan Riley is confident the government will not allow new exploration permits.
We feel like it's a win after years and years of taking a stand for climate justice. We encourage Megan Woods to really back her words and declare a ban on block offers and current oil extraction projects.
The conference ends tomorrow. In Wellington for Checkpoint, ko Katie Scotcher Tēnei.
Investigators looking into a fire that killed at least 64 people at a busy shopping mall in Siberia say a security guard had turned off the public address system and exits had been blocked. The fire swept through the upper floors of the Winter Cherry shopping centre at the coal mining city of Karamovo, where a cinema complex and children's play area were located. Dozens of children are feared to be among the dead. CNN's Max Foster has this report.
The fire ripped through the shopping centre as it was packed with people, billowing smoke across the Siberian city of Kemerovo. Hundreds of people were inside the Winter Cherry entertainment complex on Sunday afternoon as the emergency services were called to reports of smoke.
At 4:10 in the afternoon, we received information about smoke in the shopping mall on the 4th floor, where children's playing rooms and cinemas were situated.
As around 100 people were evacuated, others were trapped by the fire inside. Witnesses say they saw people jumping from the windows in a desperate attempt to escape. At first, emergency workers couldn't get to the upper floors of the building because of the strength of the fire, which caused part of the 4th floor to collapse, rescuing people instead from the roof with cranes.
Investigators have been working round the clock. Eyewitnesses and victims, including tenants and owners of shops, are being questioned. 4 suspected people were detained and also questioned.
The mall contained a cinema, bowling alley, children's centre and a petting zoo. Dozens of people, including at least 4 children, have been killed and many others are in hospital or are missing.
Currently, 20 psychologists are working with 17 relatives. I mean those who have called us and said that they cannot contact their children or some adults who, according to their information, were in the shopping mall.
An investigation has been launched and the governor of the Kemerovo region has announced the victims' families will receive around $18,000 for each relative killed in the fire. But as rescue crews still search the site and as the death toll rises, the families of those killed will have questions as to why the fire in this coal mining town turned out to be so deadly.
A former Australian rugby rep is calling on New Zealanders to donate their brains so that people can study the effects of, well, collision injuries in sports like rugby. Peter Fitzsimons, who played as lock for the Wallabies, was one of 6 former sports stars to pledge their brains to science at Sydney University today. Hello, Peter Fitzsimons. We are hoping that we are going to get him. We have technical issues with Peter Fitzsimons. It's a fascinating story with huge implications for New Zealand. We do have him now.
John,
Here he
I'll just
goes.
say this. I was a footballer through much of the 80s, early 90s. I never worried about concussion. I got knocked out in a test match, woke up and played the game of my life. I was so angry. It never occurred to me that there could be any issue. We footballers of the 80s and 90s were confident that it was only boxers that could get into trouble. Somehow we had this naive belief that if your brain was hit by a punched fist in a glove, then there was a problem. But if you got hit by a knee, you got hit by a bare fist, you got hit by a shoulder, you'd be okay because we were footballers. It only ever happened to boxers. And as the years went by, I, for one, realised I was wrong. And so we're still in an age where we know so much more about concussion, and yet still you have this ludicrous situation of people that are clearly concussed going on to play. As to the question of what we've launched today, it's called the Australian Sports Brain Bank, and it's like the Boston Brain Bank, but what we're wanting are people to pledge their brain. So particularly athletes, not only elite athletes, but people who've played a lot of football, a lot of collision sports, to pledge their brains when they die so that the brain can be examined, can be extracted after their death. There's a better medical word for that. I'm not sure what it is. Somebody will tell me. And examined to see if it's got signs of CTE so that we in Australia can know more about the impact of collision sports.
But Peter Fitzsimons, having listened to that answer, the prima facie evidence is that your brain is fine. But if it is, that's good luck rather than good management, isn't it? And we are talking in this country about our national sport here. And when I played rugby, we used to joke. How many fingers am I holding up? 194? I mean, we used to joke about head injuries. So we are talking about generations of people who have had these head knocks and just ignored them.
Well, you will find, I've heard, look, I hear whispers about Wallabies, I hear whispers about All Blacks, of who's in good shape and who's in not. I tell you what, I hear raw, not whispers in rugby league of, generations ahead of me, people in serious trouble. I heard the other day about a former star of the 1980s, late 1980s, who wanders around homeless on the streets not far from Leichhardt, and, wearing his old jersey, and they just say, well, he's gaga. He took too many hits. And that's what happens. And look, the question here is, given I'm talking to you, John, in New Zealand, obviously rugby is New Zealand's favourite sport. Do I advocate we stop rugby? Absolutely not. But the key is this. We in Australia and you in New Zealand and all around the world, we have to raise our kids that are playing collision sports on a very simple mantra. Yeah. If in doubt, sit it out. That means if you take a hit, if you can see sparkles, if you're feeling vague, if you're not sure, don't go on. And we need parents and coaches, and I don't care if the score is 19-18 in the grand final and there's 5 minutes to go and you're the best kicker or the best scrummager or whatever. There is nothing more important than the health of your brain. So everybody has to know the mantra, if in doubt, sit it out. And when it comes to All Blacks Wallabies Test and comes to provincial matches and comes to subbies of the Takapuna Prawns versus the Dubbo Wombats, everybody has to observe that same protocol. If people are knocked out, you don't get them back on next week in a fortnight. You don't tell them to shake it off. You don't tell them to come up and say it was something other than concussion. It's taken seriously.
One final question, because I know you're very busy, and we really appreciate you fronting for us, Peter, at incredibly short notice. But do you want some New Zealand brains?
Yes. No, it's quite seriously, we do. We will, if you Google the Australian Sports Brain Bank and make contact, what we would love would be, initially, we would love pledges so that people can pledge their brain after they die. And if New Zealanders have a family member that passes away and you have a suspicion, particularly have a suspicion that I think my father or my grandfather, there were probably issues in the number of concussions he took. Again, follow up. They're wanting families to contact them and to expand this.
Peter Fitzsimons, former Wallaby, really big issue around collision injuries, concussion injuries from some of the sports we play. The marine industry says new jobs have already been created and economic benefits are already being felt from the America's Cup being held in Auckland in 2021 after months of delays and back and forth between the government, Team New Zealand and Auckland Council. A plan for the Cup's base has finally been locked in. The plan, which will cost over $200 million, has seen one small wharf extension. We'll see the industrial silos on Wynyard Wharf are removed. Sally Murphy has more on this.
Marine Industry Association Director Peter Busfield says delays in the Cup-based decision have been embarrassing, but the industry is relieved a plan is now locked in.
America's Cup coming here, we're already seeing an increase in boat sales, commercial entities looking to buy charter vessels. Indeed, the syndicates are already looking at support vessels. I think there's going to be 60 vessels required to be built for running the America's Cup and servicing all the syndicate boats. So we're getting increase in business from Invercargill through to the far north.
Mr Busfield says the marine industry has hired 60 apprentices in the last few months. He expects in the lead up to the Cup about 600 apprentices will be needed. He says the cost to the taxpayer and ratepayers is significant, but will benefit everyday New Zealanders, not just those in the marine industry.
Certainly in the tourism industry, in the construction industry, flowers and florists. There was one super yacht in Bermuda that spent $300,000 on flowers on their vessel over a couple of month period. So there's opportunities for a whole lot of niche marketing in New Zealand to get access to these very influential people that will be literally floating to our shores.
The plan, which has not been fully disclosed yet, will cost $212 million. Auckland Council will contribute $98.5 million, with the government picking up the rest. ACT leader David Seymour says the government has made a bad deal, with economists predicting a cost-benefit ratio between 99 cents to $1.14 for every dollar invested.
Well, no private investor would stump for that. How is it that the government is the one being suckered with taxpayers' money while the private sector make out like bandits on this deal?
Mr Seymour says the deal has been rushed through because the pressure of the event moving elsewhere. Economic Development Minister David Parker says the new plan has the lowest practical cost of all options which were floated. He's confident the cut will pump millions of dollars into the country's economy. Both in the 2000 and 2003 America's Cups contributed about $500 million into the economy. Team New Zealand says it will not comment on the plan until it's signed off at a council meeting on Thursday. In Auckland for Checkpoint, Sally Murphy.
Thanks, Sally. About 30 seconds before the 6 o'clock news, lots of feedback on DHB boards, and people are asking this question: why did DHB boards wait till now to reveal to the public the millions of dollars of remedial work that needs to be done? In fact, cumulative, we think it is billions of dollars. Why were we not told when National was in power? Why wait till we have a Labour-led government? This is a gross abrogation of responsibility. DHB board should resign en masse. No wonder this person said Stephen Joyce said there was an $11.7 billion hole. He dug it. It's 6 o'clock.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good evening. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The Broadcasting Minister still has the Prime Minister's support despite the resignation of a senior RNZ News executive. Claire Curran has come under pressure over meeting Carol Hirschfeld in December and initially failing to disclose it in response to parliamentary questions. Ms Hirschfeld resigned today as RNZ's head of news after misleading her chief executive about the meeting at a Wellington cafe. The National Party leader, Simon Bridges, questioned Jacinda Ardern in Parliament this afternoon.
Does she accept that the meeting was clearly more than informal and coincidental?
Minister Curran has never claimed it was coincidental. She's acknowledged that it was in her diary. She did correct an original written question to make sure that it was correctly documented.
Jacinda Ardern responding to Simon Bridges in Parliament. The county's Manukau DHB says it was reluctant to ask the previous government for funding to fix mouldy, rotting hospital buildings because of government pressure not to go into deficit. The cost of fixing 4 Middlemore Hospital buildings and expanding the site is about $1.6 billion. The DHB was aware of the problems for up to 6 years, but held back from seeking more funding. Its acting chief executive, Gloria Johnson, told Checkpoint that was because the minister at the time, Jonathan Coleman, wanted the board to stay in surplus.
I think the government, and I think the whole government, has expected the health sector to be able to live within its means. And in order to do that, we have had to compromise on our capital investment programs.
Gloria Johnson of the county's Manukau DHB. Rescuers are struggling to recover the bodies of those who died in yesterday's deadly shopping mall fire in Siberia. At least 64 people were killed as fire swept through the Winter Cherry complex in the city of Kemerovo. Dozens of children are believed to be among the dead. Investigators say a security guard had turned off the public address system when the fire broke out and exits had been illegally blocked. 5 people have been taken into custody for questioning. The cause of the fire is not yet clear. The jury in the trial of a man charged with murdering his girlfriend has retired for the day and will return at 11 tomorrow morning. It's alleged Turiarangi Tai shot Chosen Kuraheki with a double-barrelled shotgun at her East Auckland home in April last year. The jury at the High Court in Auckland has been deliberating for just over a day. The Prostitutes Collective has lost its bid to turn a Christchurch house into its new local headquarters. A council-appointed commissioner, Ken Lawn, has refused the application, saying he's not convinced the move would benefit the area's residents. The collective brought the 2-storey Manchester Street house in the heart of the city's red light district, hoping to shift from its current location several kilometres south. Its spokesperson Catherine Healy says Mr Lawn's decision is disappointing.
We are disappointed. Obviously, our major concern is the safety and health and well-being of the sex workers, but we also hope to maintain a relationship with all the residents who, the ones that have been involved in this process, as well as, the others in the neighbourhood who are having difficulties with sex workers.
Catherine Healy says the collective doesn't plan to appeal against the decision at this stage. A square in central Christchurch has been vandalised less than 3 weeks after being reopened. Victoria Square had $7.5 million worth of restoration work done. The rebuild agency Otakaro says vandals last night forcibly removed 46 brass skate fins designed to deter skateboarding. Its general manager, John O'Hagan, says the fins are easily identifiable and anyone who knows anything about the theft should report it to the police. He says he expects the repair job to cost well over $100,000 and take several weeks to complete. More than 35 years on, relatives of 90 Argentinian soldiers killed during the Falklands War against Britain in 1982 have finally been able to formally pay their respects. The men's remains have been individually identified using modern forensic technology. The BBC's Olivia Lace-Evans reports.
On a windy hillside in the middle of the Atlantic, 214 relatives from across Argentina gathered in Darwin Cemetery to mourn those that they lost in the Falklands War. Relatives stood by the crosses of their fallen soldiers, reading from the newly inscribed names on the graves. A short ceremony was held with priests from both Buenos Aires and the islands participating. The bodies were identified thanks to DNA testing carried out by scientists for the International Red Cross last summer. It has taken months of sensitive negotiations between British, Argentinian and Falkland authorities to coordinate this week's trip.
Olivia Lace-Evans reporting. It's 6:05. To sport, and after a dominant pink ball win in the first test against England, Black Caps captain Kane Williamson says the day-night test format should stay, though it needs some tweaks. The second and final test, starting in Christchurch on Friday, will be a traditional red ball day game, but Williamson says the pink ball should be considered a success.
It was a fantastic game of cricket, certainly from our perspective, and it is different. It is quite unique in terms of what the pink ball brings. I suppose there's still some work to do on it, comparing it to the red ball, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it.
Kane Williamson. In netball, the Mystics are taking a new approach to this year's ANZ Premiership by concentrating on the psychology of the game in order to get better results at club and international level. Former Silver Fern Anna Harrison says netball is lagging behind in adopting the concept and franchises need to show urgency in taking it up.
The Ferns only have you for a small amount of time, so really by the time you get the Silver Ferns, the work has been done. So it's really ground level of netball through to your franchise to really get those teachings, so that by the time you hit that level, you're already thinking on that level.
Anna Harrison. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Nick Bollinger samples the latest from Ebb and Sparrow. We have a window on the lost world of Karachi's fireflies, because they just aren't the same under artificial light. And Anne Cohen examines the philosophy of Dutch thinker Hugo Grotius, prison escapee, shipwreck survivor, and trailblazer for the Enlightenment.
And on Lately at 10, we feature campaigners, activists and protesters, or CAPs as we like to call them. We'll have an eye not only on CAPs, but books, music, people and politics, keeping you up to date with the world at the other end of the day. Lately with Karen Hay on Nights with Brian Crump on RNZ National.
Met Service weather now through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waikato, also Coromandel Peninsula Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumaranui. Long fine spells and isolated showers. Cloud increasing late tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay fine. The remainder of the North Island fine today, apart from cloudy periods in Kapiti and Wellington. Scattered rain tomorrow. For Nelson and Marlborough, cloud increasing, rain developing this evening with heavy falls about the ranges, becoming fine tomorrow morning. Canterbury, high cloud, rain about the ranges and a few spots elsewhere. Severe gales about the high country, easing tonight, becoming fine tomorrow morning. Otago, rain clearing this afternoon, then mostly fine. Bulla and Westland, occasional rain with heavy falls and possible thunderstorms, easing to isolated showers today, becoming fine tomorrow. Fiordland and Southland, showers about Fiordland, spreading to Southland later today. Some heavy about Fiordland and Fovo Strait, showers easing tomorrow. And the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a chance of a shower. It's just gone 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Stay there, KB, because I've got a hacking cough and I'm worried that I'm not going to get through this intro, so you just bear with me. New Zealand is now the only Five Eyes nation not to take retaliatory action against Russia over the nerve agent attack on a former Russian spy and his daughter. But Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, I think I'm going to do it, says that's because New Zealand, unlike its Five Eyes partners, Australia, Canada, Britain and the US, doesn't have any undeclared Russian intelligence agents. This is confusing, this undeclared stuff. More on that in a sec. In the largest coordinated action since the Cold War, more than 20 countries have now announced the expulsion of more than 100 Russian diplomats following the nerve agent attack in Salisbury. Jacinda Ardern was asked today whether it was really credible that Russia had no one in New Zealand doing undeclared intelligence work.
It's up to us to make sure that we go and undertake that review. I understand that that's been done before, once when when the issue around Ukraine, that similar check was undertaken. But when you take into account Australia has found from, if I recall correctly, 2, then perhaps it's not that difficult to believe that we don't have anyone in New Zealand that fits that description.
What do we make of all of this? Jill Doherty, a former CNN Moscow bureau chief and foreign correspondent, is a member of the Advisory Council of the Woodrow Wilson Centre's Kennan Institute. Her work has focused on President Vladimir Putin's foreign policy objectives and how he's selling them at home very successfully, if the election is anything to go by. I asked Jill if it's absurd to think Russia doesn't have intelligence officers everywhere in its embassies, including New Zealand, and do they declare all their intelligence personnel?
No, usually it's kind of part of diplomacy that every country has somebody who is in intelligence, and they come in, they're, let's say, the agricultural attaché or something like that, but it's well known. And because the other country wants to do it, it's accepted. But when problems come, those are the people who are kicked out. Now, of course, it's not always pleasant. There might actually be somebody who really is lurking under the cover of some other job and is carrying out nefarious things in that country, and they won't be greeted as just kind of, the usual diplomatic approach.
So, Jill, this is a situation to which we turn a blind eye, all things being normal. But when things go awry, the people we have known are here or there or everywhere suddenly get outed and put on the plane.
Yes, correct. But I mean, look, let's back up. What is happening right now? I think the significance of this act is not just that, let's say, the United States or the UK is kicking out diplomats. It's the concerted action by, I think it's 18, it could be more by now, countries that have come together, basically EU, NATO countries that have come together and are jointly expelling diplomats. And that's the significance, because it was meant to be a signal that, Russia, you have done things that are simply not acceptable. Enough is enough, and we're really going to hit back at you. So part of it is diplomatic, it's a signal, but the other part of it could actually disrupt some activities that Russia has in certain countries, which are intelligence activities.
Jill, we always take the point of view of the West looking into Russia, but you are able to do the reverse as well because you've just been there covering the elections, right? How is this playing out in Russia? Does the person on the street in Russia give a damn that diplomats are being expelled from throughout Europe at a rate of knots? And what is Putin's message around all of this?
Boy, that's a good question. I was just looking at some of Russian TV, and the way it's being interpreted, I would say, by central, government-controlled TV, is that this is the world ganging up on Vladimir Putin, ganging up on Russia, and trying to exclude Russia from any type of activities with other countries, and that this is really an attack. So it is actually being covered quite prominently in the Russian media. And again, with this idea that it is the world against Russia. And this, as you mentioned, I just came back from Russia covering the election, Vladimir Putin's election. And a lot of this played into why he was reelected. Because remember, at the time that election was taking place last week, you had the spy scandal, the poisoning of the former spy in London at fever pitch, and Putin and the media in Russia were depicting it exactly this way, that this is the world against Russia. Therefore, Russians must unite. And there was a lot of, I would say, kind of let's get together, let's support President Putin, let's support Russia. Unity is important. That helped him in the election, and I think it will continue to help him now through this very difficult period where he really does have the world arrayed against him. Unfortunately, it's a very negative thing. I'm convinced that we are in for continuing very difficult times with Russia. And the more you have diplomats kicked out, even if it is to send a message, the less communication you have, and the more possibility of misperception, misinterpretation. It's not good.
No, it's not good. And it's not good with the heightened rhetoric. So we're looking at the most serious crisis between the West and Russia since, I guess, Russia seized Crimea, right? And
oh, yes.
And if Vladimir Putin is playing to a constituency at home who support him, who have just re-elected him, who are profoundly pro-Russia nationalists, then we just see the rhetoric heightened, we see more expulsions, we see Putin standing his ground, and then where do we end up?
I think we end up where I would like to think we wouldn't, but with a very emotional approach to each other. Anger, fear, retribution, nationalism, etc., instead of sober discussion, because this is getting dangerous. I mean, you have now both sides, but especially the Russians, talking about potentially using new nuclear weapons. Remember, just a couple of weeks ago, President Putin had this big display of the new nuclear weapons that Russia has. There's a lot of chest-thumping about nukes, and that is very dangerous. I don't believe at all that President Putin wants a nuclear war, but this kind of playing to the base that I'm stronger than you can be very dangerous because, again, miscalculation, misinterpretation can lead to, pretty dangerous circumstances.
It's Jill Doherty, who's a former bureau chief for CNN in Moscow, just back, in fact, from covering the Russian presidential election. It is 16 minutes past 6. The National Party is accusing the Prime Minister of passing the buck on claims a New Zealand First MP, backbench MP, tried to threaten an opposition MP. National's Mark Mitchell says Jenny Marcroft told him, on behalf of a minister, to stop supporting a project in his electorate if he wanted it to get public funding. But New Zealand First says that's not true. It's a misunderstanding, and National's making a mountain out of a molehill. What's going on? Here's our political reporter, Craig McCulloch.
National went public with the story yesterday. Today, it turned up the heat.
Ultimately, you've got a very serious, rotten situation here.
National's leader, Simon Bridges, is demanding answers.
Who's in control here? What's going on? What I've heard the Prime Minister say is that effectively this is Winston Peters' problem. Well, this is a government. She can't compartmentalise this. She needs to lead it, and she does need to get to the bottom of it.
The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has been investigating. She says she's spoken to all 4 New Zealand First Ministers, and they've all assured her they had nothing to do with it.
My job is to take ministers at their word. They have each assured me they were not involved in what's happened here, and that leaves this to be an issue about an MP's behaviour, and for that, it's up to the leader of New Zealand First to deal with.
So how is Winston Peters going to deal with it?
Well, I think Mark's making a mountain out of a molehill.
The New Zealand First leader says the whole thing is a misunderstanding. His MP, Jenny Marcroft, misspoke. Indeed, he says the project wouldn't even qualify for public funding, so how could it be withheld?
Whatever she might have said, she said it and regrets that she missaid it, because the last thing she wanted to do was offend somebody who's a local MP that she's been working with.
But if Mr Mitchell got the wrong end of the stick, what was the right end? If Jenny Marcroft misspoke, what did she mean to say?
What was the purpose of the discussion? Are you guys so desperate for news that you're trying to analyse the discussion? I know, but you're asking a silly question because I wasn't there. How would I know?
So still unanswered questions and no answers from Ms Marcroft, who again failed to front up to media. In the absence of explanations, Simon Bridges is filling the void, attacking the government's wider flagship Provincial Growth Fund.
Frankly, it's the Political Growth Fund. It's a political slush fund, and you're going to be seeing it used in this sort of way for politics and for political purposes rather than for good projects that matter.
In Parliament, he raised another project, a cycle trail in Clutha, which is reportedly in line for government funding. He says as recently as last year, the co-chair of that project was another New Zealand First MP, Mark Patterson. The government says the fund is not political and all decisions will be based on merit, not politics. Atu iti whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Craig McCulloch.
Coming up to 90 minutes past 6, Auckland residents are divided on a proposal to change rubbish collection in the city from weekly to fortnightly, recycling already fortnightly. The council also wants to start a weekly food scraps collection and roll out a pay-as-you-throw system for the whole city. Jessie Chang went to Mount Eden to talk to locals to see what they think.
Tuesday is rubbish collection day for Guy Abbott, who lives on Sherbourne Road. Every week he and his family fill up their red bin with rubbish, but with council plans that might have to change.
I have concerns that there'll be rubbish left lying around, if it's not picked up. The bins now are a lot smaller than they used to be, and then they're brought in the recycling bin. So, yeah, we've changed in the past, I guess.
But his neighbour Sandra Biggins says the fortnightly collection is a great idea.
I don't put my bin out every week because I've got very, very little garbage to put out, so every second week's fine with me because I don't put it out every week anyway.
Ms Biggins says she lives by herself and she recycles often, as do her neighbours. A few houses down, Greg Williams says he also supports a 2-week rubbish collection. He says his family of 4 only fill up their red bin up to halfway every week.
We make extensive use of our recycling bin, which is already fortnightly. We also do a lot of composting, which reduces our waste output a lot. So the combination of those measures would be okay with fortnightly for our situation.
But Mr Williams is unconvinced about the pay-as-you-throw system and says he wants to be sure that rates do go down if there's an extra cost for rubbish.
Our rates are already large and expensive. If we're then paying, like for water charges, another cost on top of that for rubbish, it does raise a question of what value are we getting for our current rates bill, which is, like I say, huge.
But Auckland Council says rates should go down by about $120 with the new model. It says West Auckland already uses the pay-as-you-throw system, with the North Shore to be added next month. The council's waste planning manager, Parul Sood, says food waste makes up nearly half the weight of an average household's bin. She says by introducing a weekly food scrap collection that will allow rubbish pickups to be extended to every 2 weeks.
We want to minimise the amount of people put out in that rubbish bin, which is just going to landfill. It's a great idea to actually recycle and take your food scrap out if you can. So that's the incentive behind it.
The public consultation on the council's waste management plan ends tomorrow. For Checkpoint, call Jessie Chang, TNA.
Torrential rain last Friday carved a 20-metre wide, 5-metre deep trench in State Highway 1 just north of Kaitaia, cutting off the only public road to Cape Reinga. No mail has been able to get through since then. Commuters have been forced to find alternative routes if their car is up to it to get around, including an unofficial detour along 90 Mile Beach. One student even paddleboarded to school with her mum this morning. The other option is a police-led convoy through a forest road. Now, our reporter Nita Blake-Person, who filed from north of the cut, joined the northbound convoy this morning at 5:30 this evening. She joined the convoy heading back, and she is on the phone now. Nita, where are you?
John, I am just above north of Hauhora Head. So as the crow flies, very close to where I've been all day in Pukenui, but it's been a much longer journey to get here. I've just come back through the forestry road, which took a lot longer, it felt, than it did this morning. I think all the dust was picked up throughout the day. A lot more people have been driving on it, and it felt pretty gnarly in parts this evening.
What sort of vehicle are you in? Are you in a good, robust car, or are you in the old RNZ $30 rental?
I'm in a humble Honda Civic, so
right.
It's far from the four-wheel drive machine I had envisioned for a road like that, but it does the trick. It's getting us there. It needs a good wash now, but yeah, it's not the smoothest ride, I'll tell you that.
Okay, so what's that forestry road like?
Well, apparently graders have been through several times. I feel like when I went through this morning, maybe they've just done it quite freshly. But looking at it now, there's some pretty big potholes in it. It's really well used by forestry trucks. And I understand if you're going through when you're not on the convoy, you are kind of playing with fire a bit there because the forestry trucks really do hoon through. But it goes through some big wide plains, cleared out. There's wild horses roaming over the place. It's really gorgeous. But in some of the areas where the trees haven't been felled, it's quite damp and there's some really muddy bits, which, you want to go pretty slow over those.
I'm slightly envious of the experience, although not necessarily of the road. What State Highway 1, what sort of nick is that in? Because by golly, that is a big old gap. Are they going to have it ready before Easter or by Easter?
That's the hope at this stage. So I was last looking at the hole a couple of hours ago, and it's pretty impressive the rate at which they're working at. When I went down earlier today, the hole was, in terms of measuring the workers who are in there, you could see definitely a man standing fully tall, and he's well below the road, and that was just gradually climbing as the day went on. When I left, a couple of hours ago, they were optimistic that they might have one lane open tomorrow, but failing that, it'll be, Thursday, at least traffic able to go in one direction at a time across there, saving a heck of a trip around the back.
Thanks, Nita. Just before you go, a technical question that our listeners won't be remotely interested in, but I'm fascinated by. So you filed for us from north of that cut in the road today, did you?
Indeed, yes, from Pukenui.
And how did you get it back to us? How did you get the material back to us?
The wonders of the internet. I was walking the back of the car.
They've got it that far north.
Yeah. Fortunately, apparently it was a bit dicey for a few days after the road caved in. The Wi-Fi got affected, but they're back on track now.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Nita. Nice work. Nita Blake-Person, who has been filing for us and travelling the road, and was probably having a wonderful time in the far north. Let's head to the south. The North Canterbury farmer whose cattle were slaughtered after Mycoplasma bovis was detected on his farm worries it may be years before he's compensated. Kerry Dwyer sent all 400 of his calves to slaughter in September last year, but says he can't start rebuilding his business until the Ministry for Primary Industries pays him for his loss. The government has said farmers affected by Mycoplasma bovis will be compensated for their verifiable losses. Yesterday it announced all cattle infected with the disease will be culled at a cost of around $60 million. Now, Kerry told our reporter Maya Burry he worries it may be years before some farmers are paid.
We'd bought the calves in March last year, and we'd had no sign of the disease. They were tested in August and shown to have the disease.
And so what happened after that?
We were placed under a restricted place notice where the animals could not be shifted from our farm except to slaughter. So we said, well, we'll slaughter them. It's the only thing to do, because if we kept them here, ultimately we would have an animal welfare issue because we're overstocked as they get bigger. They start as little calves and they get bigger. We would end up overstocked, they'd be under stress, they would die of the disease, and we'd have an animal welfare issue. So we said, we'll kill them, which was not a normal time for killing them, and it cost us $10 a head to get them killed. And we're now talking with MPI about compensation. So all these farmers that are going to have animals killed of the 22 or 25,000, they're going to be facing the same as us, dealing with an MPI organisation that has absolutely no guidelines on how to compensate farmers. While they publicly say that they're going to compensate for verifiable losses, they actually have no guidelines. When I ask them for what the guidelines are that they give their assessors for dealing with compensation, they give me nothing because they haven't got anything.
Kerry, I mean, plain and simple, what would you like to see happen?
I would like MPI compensation to publicise their guidelines on how they assess claims, and I would like some independent people to review those guidelines before we get into court cases arguing with them.
And so what are you meant to do in the meantime, Kerry?
Well, I just keep plugging away with the MPI trying to get answers. Yeah.
And what's happening with the farm at the moment?
Oh, well, we're trying to sell silage. We sold silage in November because that was permissible, and all the science around the disease shows that there was no chance of infection then. I was lined up to sell silage this coming week, and the buyer I had lined up tells me that his legal advice says don't come near me. So I've lost a buyer and I'm looking for more. That's pretty tough, yeah.
Maya Burry talking to Kerry Dwyer. We would love to hear from other farmers in this situation. Kerry suggesting it could be years before some farmers are paid. 4 months in one case, and that farmer still hasn't received the compensation for the cattle who were slaughtered because of having Mycoplasma bovis. A lot of cows, a lot of cattle to be slaughtered, around $60 million worth in total. That is Checkpoint for tonight. Just before we go, a bit of feedback in on the DHBs. The acting CEO of Counties Manukau DHB was so refreshing, under reasonably persistent questioning. She said, yes, I like this woman, says one listener. All this major infrastructure, hospitals, schools, railways, major airports, etc., needs to be funded directly by government, not come out of their ops budgets, says Kerry. Over the coming days on Checkpoint, we are going to look at what we think is the total catch-up required in terms of CapExes. So this is deferred maintenance, essentially work that hasn't been done and needs to be done. This is not future-proofing, it is just catching up. We think it is an astronomical total. It is work we've been doing for some time. We're hoping to begin to be able to put the figures together, and we hope we will have that for you in the next days or week. On behalf of the Checkpoint team, thank you for being with us tonight. We appreciate your company. It is coming up to 6:30. Katrina along with the headlines after the theme tune.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Jacinda Ardern has defended the broadcasting minister in Parliament in the face of National Party attacks over the resignation of a senior RNZ News executive. The county's Manukau DHB says it was unwilling to ask for money to fix rotting hospital buildings because of pressure from the previous government. Air New Zealand is pushing for tougher laws after a near miss by a drone at Auckland Airport. And Victoria Square in Christchurch has been vandalised less than 3 weeks after reopening. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Wellington band Ebb and Sparrow peer into some dark corners, but also find places of comfort and hope on their new album. I'm Nick Bollinger, and I'll be reviewing Ebb and Sparrow's Seeing Things in the Sampler. I'll be discussing the startling songs of 20-year-old Sophie Allison, otherwise known as Soccer Mommy, the life and death matters of a new